Most gardeners think compost is something you buy in spring. A few expensive bags from the garden center, a little spread around the tomatoes, a little mixed into a raised bed. And then it's gone by midsummer, and you're right back to buying fertility all over again. But the gardeners who actually build productive backyards understand something different. Compost is not a product, it's a system. And once that system is working, your kitchen scraps, fallen leaves, weeds, coffee grounds, cardboard, grass clippings, and old crop residue stop being waste and start becoming the thing that feeds your garden all year. And the difference between a garden that constantly needs outside inputs and a garden that feeds itself is often just one simple setup behind the shed or along the fence line. A 3-bin compost system, because one random pile usually turns into a mess, too wet in one corner, too dry in another, half rotted on the bottom, fresh scraps on the top. And by the time you need compost, it still isn't ready, but a 3-bin system changes everything. It gives you 1 bin to collect, 1 bin to heat, and 1 bin to cure, which means instead of waiting and guessing, you create a steady rotation of fertility that keeps feeding your soil season after season. And that is the difference between throwing things away and turning your entire backyard into a closed-loop food system. The first bin is the collection bin. This is where all the raw material begins: vegetable peels from the kitchen, coffee grounds, tea leaves, pulled weeds before they go to seed, spent annual plants, grass clippings in thin layers, chicken bedding, rabbit manure, autumn leaves, shredded paper, torn cardboard, straw, small twigs chopped fine. This first bin matters more than most people realize, because it determines whether composting becomes easy or becomes a chore you give up on after 2 weeks. If the system is inconvenient, you won't use it. If the pile is too far away, you'll stop carrying scraps. If there are no dry materials nearby, your pile will turn into slime. If the bin is too small, it won't heat, and if it's too open, it dries out before decomposition really begins. So place the system where you'll actually use it. Not at the far end of the property if you know you'll never walk there in the rain with a bucket of peelings. Put it close enough to the kitchen or garden path that adding material becomes part of your normal routine, and make each bin large enough to hold real volume. About 3 feet wide, 3 feet deep, and 3 feet tall is a good starting size for most backyards. That's enough material to generate heat but still small enough to manage by hand. You can build it from pallets, rough lumber, welded wire, or simple wooden bays with removable front slats. The materials matter less than the function. You need airflow, easy access, and enough room to turn one pile into the next bin without fighting the structure. Now here is where most compost piles fail. They fail because people add only the wet stuff. They dump in fruit peels, lettuce leaves, kitchen scraps, and grass clippings. But they forget the dry carbon materials that keep the pile balanced. And without that balance, the pile becomes dense, sour, smelly, and airless. So the real secret to free compost all year is not just collecting waste, it's collecting the right mix of waste. You need 2 broad categories: greens and browns. Greens are the nitrogen-rich materials. Fresh grass clippings, kitchen scraps, coffee grounds, fresh manure from herbivores, green weeds, and young plant trimmings. Browns are the carbon-rich materials: dry leaves, straw, shredded cardboard, wood shavings in moderation, torn paper, dry stalks, and dead garden debris. And if you remember nothing else, remember this: every time you add something wet and green, add something dry and brown with it. A simple rule is to add roughly 2 parts browns to 1 part greens by volume. Not because composting is a chemistry experiment that has to be perfect, but because that ratio keeps the pile open, absorbent, and active. This is why autumn leaves are not a nuisance. They're compost gold. They're your free carbon bank for the whole year ahead. So when fall comes, don't burn them, bag them, or haul them away. Store them dry. Pile them beside the compost bins. Stuff them into wire cages. Keep shredded cardboard under cover. Because those dry materials are what let the system keep working in spring, summer, and winter when the kitchen scraps keep coming. Once the first bin starts filling, build the pile in layers: a layer of browns, a layer of greens, a dusting of old compost or garden soil if you have it, then more browns, then more greens. You do not need to obsess over perfect layering, but you do need to prevent clumps of one material from dominating the whole pile. A thick mat of wet grass will rot into sludge. A solid block of leaves will dry out and sit there for months. Large stems take too long. Whole cardboard boxes mat together. So, the smaller and looser the materials are, the faster the system works. Chop bulky plants when you can. Shred cardboard, break up stems, mix grass clippings with leaves, scatter kitchen scraps instead of dumping them in one wet heap, and keep the moisture right. The pile should feel like a wrung-out sponge. Moist, but not dripping. If it's too dry, decomposition slows to a crawl. If it's too wet, air disappears and smell begins. That is why the 3-bin system is so powerful, because instead of trying to fix a bad pile after the fact, it encourages you to build a good pile from the beginning. When the first bin is full or nearly full, stop adding to it. That is the moment many gardeners miss. They keep throwing new material onto the same pile forever. And because fresh scraps are constantly being added, nothing ever finishes. The top is fresh, the middle is half rotted, the bottom is compost, but buried and inaccessible. This is exactly why a single bin system usually disappoints people. With 3 bins, the moment bin 1 is full, you move that pile into bin 2. And this is where the real transformation happens. Turning the pile into the second bin mixes the materials, adds oxygen, breaks up wet pockets, and reactivates the whole mass. The outside goes in, the inside comes out, dry material mixes with wet material, and suddenly the pile starts heating properly. That heat matters because it speeds decomposition, reduces weed seeds, and begins turning rough backyard waste into dark, crumbly fertility. In an active pile, the center should get noticeably warm, sometimes very warm. Steam may rise when you open it on a cold morning. That heat is not magic. It's microbial life exploding into activity because you finally gave it the right combination of food, water, and air. And here's the critical point. Compost is not made by time alone. It's made by biology. And biology works fastest when you create the right conditions. During the heating phase in bin 2, check the pile every several days. If it smells foul, it needs more browns and more air. If it looks dry and inactive, it needs water. If it has collapsed into a heavy mass, turn it again. One good turn can save weeks of waiting. This is also the stage where many gardeners realize just how much fertility they were throwing away before. Because the spent bean vines, carrot tops, cabbage leaves, straw mulch, pulled annuals, and kitchen scraps that once went to the trash are now becoming the thing that will grow the next crop. This is what self-sufficiency actually looks like in practice. Not a romantic idea, not a social media fantasy, just one useful system turning everyday waste into next season's abundance. And if you have chickens, rabbits, ducks, or even just a family that produces lots of kitchen scraps, this system becomes even more powerful. Because manure, bedding, food scraps, and garden waste together make a compost stream rich enough to feed beds all year without constantly buying bags from the store. After the hot phase slows down, the pile moves into bin 3. This is the curing bin. And this is the stage that produces the compost you actually want to spread on your garden. Fresh compost is still breaking down. It may still contain recognizable bits of stems or leaves. It may still be slightly unstable. But cured compost is different. It smells earthy, it feels crumbly, it holds moisture like a sponge, and it no longer looks like the scraps and debris you started with. This third bin is what makes year-round compost possible, because while bin 1 is being filled and bin 2 is actively cooking, bin 3 is quietly finishing into usable garden fertility. So instead of waiting for one pile to do everything, you always have all 3 stages moving at once. One pile beginning, one pile transforming, one pile ready or nearly ready to use. And that steady rotation is what gives you compost not once a year, but throughout the growing season. Now let's talk about what should never go into the system, because a productive compost setup is not the same as a garbage dump. Do not add meat, dairy, oily food, or large amounts of cooked leftovers. Do not add pet waste from carnivores. Do not add heavily diseased plants unless you know your pile gets hot enough to deal with them. Do not add perennial weeds with persistent roots unless they are fully dried out first. And do not keep throwing in seed heads from aggressive weeds and then wonder why your compost spreads them across the garden. A compost system works best when you feed it intelligently. The goal is not to make the biggest pile possible. The goal is to make the most useful compost possible. That means clean inputs, balanced inputs, and enough discipline to keep the system from becoming a place where every problem in the yard gets hidden instead of solved. And here is what makes this system especially powerful. It works in every season. In spring, it receives pulled weeds, seedling thinnings, grass clippings, and manure. In summer, it absorbs spent crops, kitchen scraps, prunings, and mulch residue. In fall, it feasts on leaves, stalks, vines, and the remains of the main harvest. And in winter, when the garden seems quiet, it keeps going with food scraps, ashes in small amounts, bedding, cardboard, and all the stored leaves you saved from autumn. The pile may slow in cold weather, but the system does not stop, and that means your fertility does not stop either. This is one of the most important lessons in gardening. The garden does not begin in spring. And soil building does not begin when planting begins. It begins whenever organic matter becomes available, which is all year, So the households that have rich compost every season are not the ones doing something complicated. They are simply the ones who stopped treating fertility as a spring purchase and started treating it as a year-round harvest. When the compost in bin 3 is finished, use it where it matters most. Spread it on vegetable beds before planting. Top-dress heavy feeders like tomatoes, squash, cabbage, and corn. Mix it into transplant holes. Lay it around fruit trees and berry bushes. Use it to recharge tired raised beds. Sift some for seed-starting mixes or potting blends, and spread coarse unfinished bits as mulch around less demanding crops. This is why the system feeds your garden, not just because compost adds nutrients, but because it improves the soil itself. It helps sandy soil hold water. It helps clay soil loosen and breathe. It feeds earthworms, it supports microbial life, it buffers swings in moisture, and over time, it changes the ground from something you struggle against into something that works with you. That is the real power of compost. It does not just grow this season's lettuce. It builds next year's tomatoes, the year after that's potatoes, the orchard, the berry patch, the whole backyard food system, and here's the final insight most gardeners miss. The 3-bin system is not really about compost. It's about independence, because every bucket of finished compost represents money you didn't spend, waste you didn't throw away, nutrients you kept on your own land, and soil that gets richer instead of poorer every year. 1 bin collecting, 1 bin heating, 1 bin curing. That simple rotation can feed a surprisingly large garden if you stay consistent, not because it's glamorous, not because it's trendy, but because it works. And the gardeners who succeed long-term are usually not the ones chasing complicated hacks. They are the ones building quiet systems that keep producing in the background, systems that turn scraps into soil, soil into food, and food into a household that depends a little less on outside inputs every season. So if you want free compost all year, stop thinking in terms of piles. Start thinking in terms of flow, input, heat, cure, use, repeat. Because the backyard that feeds you is usually the backyard that wastes nothing. And a 3-bin compost system is where that kind of garden begins.